Greetings! Today we will talk about the era of great geographical discoveries. The Bartolomew Diaz, one of the most famous Portuguese navigator-discoverers who conquered the waters of the Atlantic in the 15th century. In 1486, in search of a sea route from Europe to India, Bartolomew Diaz was the first European to circumnavigate Africa from the south and discover the Cape of Good Hope, entering the waters of the Indian Ocean. 9 years after the return of Diaz, the Portuguese family equipped an expedition to India. Vasco de Gama became the head of this expedition, and Diaz accompanied him to the Gold Coast, Guinea. When de Gama returned and confirmed the correctness of Diaz's guesses, a more powerful fleet, led by Pedro Cabral, was organized in India. On this journey, Diaz commanded one of the ships. He participated in the discovery of Brazil, but during the transportation towards Africa, near the Cape of Good Hope, which he once called the Cape of Storms, the flotilla fell into a powerful storm, as a result of which 4 ships were forever lost. One of the lost ships was led by Diaz. Thus, Bartolomeu died in the same waters that brought him fame. Vasco de Gama, Portuguese explorer and navigator who discovered the sea route from Europe to India around the Cape of Good Hope, the second viceroy of Portuguese India, 1524. Based on the reports of Diaz, Vasco da Gama developed the route of his voyage to India. The journey began in 1497 and lasted more than 2 years. Of the 170 team members, only 44 returned home. Vasco da Gama reached the coveted shores of India, although the voyage was very difficult. In order to change the priorities of Indian politics and fight corruption in the old administration, Juan III decides to appoint the 64-year-old harsh and incorruptible Vasco da Gama as the 5th Viceroy of India. In April of 1524, Vasco da Gama, together with his sons Estevan and Paolo, set off on his last and third trip to India. He led a fleet of 14 ships, led by the flagship Santa Catarina. After a difficult journey, 4 or 5 ships were lost. In September of 1524, the expedition arrived in India. Immediately upon arrival in India, using his powers, Vasco da Gama takes tough measurements against the abuses of the colonial administration and establishes a new order in the Portuguese India. However, 3 months after his arrival, da Gama fell ill with malaria and died on the eve of Christmas 1524 in the city of Kochi. The city of Vasco da Gama in India is named after Vasco da Gama. The lunar crater Vasco da Gama, the Brazilian football club Vasco da Gama, the bridge in Lisbon is named after Vasco da Gama. Christopher Columbus, a Spanish navigator, the discoverer of South America, the Bahamas and Antilles, the coasts of Central and South America. One of the greatest discoveries in history was made by Christopher Columbus. Initially, he proposed to the Portuguese king the route of the western route to India. Due to the high risk, he was not accepted at first, but later the Spanish Queen Isabella supported his proposal. In the summer of 1492, as part of 3 caravels, Santa Maria, Nina, and Pinta, the expedition set off in search of a new path to fabulously rich India. Columbus considered the open lands to be India, but it was not the expected fairy land. An outstanding navigator made 4 trips to the shores of America. He discovered the Bahamas, the islands of Cuba, Dominica, Nevis, Puerto Rico and Haiti, the Lesser Antilles, the islands of Trinidad and Jamaica. Before his death, Columbus was convinced that he had opened the way to India. During the 4th trip, Columbus discovered the mainland south of Cuba, the coast of Central America, and proved that the Atlantic Ocean separated from the Pacific by an insurmountable barrier, which he heard from the Indians. The seriously ill Columbus was transported to Seville. He could not achieve the restoration of the rights and privileges granted to him, and spent all the money of his expedition comrades. He died, saying his last words, "Into your hands, Lord, I entrust my spirit." May 20, 1506, in Valladolid, Spain. He was buried in the cathedral in the chapel of Luis de Cedra of the city of Seville. Contemporaries hardly noticed his death. The great significance of the discoveries of Columbus for Spain was recognized only in the middle of the 16th century, after the conquest of Mexico, Peru, and the states in the north of the Andes, when ships with silver and gold went to Europe. Ferdinand Magellan, Portuguese navigator in the Spanish service. He led the first successful round-the-world expedition, during which Magellan himself died. 5 ships with a crew of 265 people successfully crossed the Atlantic Ocean. In October 1520, the expedition entered a narrow strait, later called the Magellan, along which they wandered for a long time in search of a passage to the then unknown ocean. During these searches, the Tierra del Fuego archipelago was discovered. Finally, Magellan discovered an outlet to the ocean, which he called the Pacific. For 3 months of sailing, there was not a single storm on it. Having reached the Philippine Islands, Magellan encountered hostile local residents and died in one of the skirmishes with them. The remnants of an expedition of 18 people on the ship Victoria, led by Juan Elcano, circled Africa and returned to Spain on September 6, 1522. The lands discovered by Magellan cover all the coasts of South America, La Plata, and the Patagonian Andes. He was the first to circle the southern part of America. Abel Tasman, Dutch navigator, explorer, and merchant. On November 24, 1642, he discovered a new mainland and an island near it, which the sailors called Van Diemen's Land, modern Tasmania. And on December 13, 1642, sailing past its coastline, the traveler discovered another island, south, and he was part of New Zealand. Further travel led the expedition to the islands of Tonga, 1643. On the way back, the sailors visited the islands of Fiji and rounded New Guinea. Abel Tasman made a major contribution to the exploration of the southern coast of Tasmania, including the archipelagos of Fiji and Tonga. He wrote down his impressions of what he saw in his diary. The team was amazed by the lush vegetation, familiar and unfamiliar animals, and the presence of a large amount of clean water. Also, the expedition commander described the appearance of the Maori and weapons, wrote down their language, sketched the natives, their clothes, villages, etc. Abel Tasman explored western New Guinea and northern Australia. The navigator accurately indicated on the map the exact contours of Australia and the island in the Gulf of the Carpentaria. He proved that Australia is a separate independent continent. Tasman worked on the maps of William Johnson. William Johnson, Dutch navigator and colonial governor. The first known European who saw the coast of Australia during the travel of 1605 to 1606. On February 26, 1606, members of the expedition of the Dutch East India Company, led by Captain Willem Johnson, landed near the modern Cape York Peninsula and became the first Europeans to reach Australia. Johnson mistook the open coast for part of the island of New Guinea and named it New Zealand. The team landed on a swampy shore near the Pennenfather River. Moving along the coast, the mouth was opened for several more years, but in general, the territory turned out to be of little use for life. It was not possible to establish good relations with the natives, despite gifts, tobacco, flour, and soap, and after a series of conflicts over women, as a result of which 10 Dutchmen were killed and their boats were burned, the team returned back. Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian navigator who may have given the American continent its name. Made 2 confirmed expeditions to the shores of South America. There is no unequivocal data on the number of voyages made by Vespucci himself. Some of it is reliably known that from May 1499 to June 1500 he participated in the expedition of Alonso de Ojeda as navigator, however, split up off the coast of modern Guyana, and the ship Vespucci went south. Passing the mouth of the Amazon, he reached the modern Cape of St. Augustine, from where he turned back and arrived in Spain through Trinidad and Haiti. During the second expedition, he reached the northern coast of Brazil and, according to him, was not supported by other evidence of the mouth of La Plata River and Patagonia, modern Argentina. Vespucci's fame in Europe was brought not so much by his expedition as the descriptions of the lands of the New World discovered by them, set out in the book Travel Notes and published in 1504. In 1507, the Germans printed a world map in circulation of 1,000 copies, on which the New World was named after Vespucci, America. At the end of his life, Vespucci was the chief cartographer and navigator of the Spanish crown. Francis Drake, English pirate, navigator, slave trader, politician and engineer, who made the second trip around the world and a number of geographical discoveries in the New World. In December 1577, Drake set out his most famous expedition. He was instructed to sail through the Magellan Channel, find suitable places for colonies and return the same way back. During this journey, the pirate crossed the Atlantic Ocean, where he opened a strait between the Tierra del Fuego and Antarctica, later named after him. 1579 crossed the Pacific, and in 1580 returned to Plymouth. Drake proved that Tierra del Fuego is an island, put the western coast of North America on the map. Thus, the navigator made a round-the-world trip, the second after Magellan, which brought him not only fame but also wealth. In 1595, during an expedition to the West Indies, he fell ill with dynestry and died on January 28, 1596, near Panama. Semen Ivanovic Desnev, a Russian navigator, discoverer of new lands, traveler and explorer of northern and eastern Siberia, passed along the entire length of the Bering Strait, from north to south. In 1641, on an expedition, Desnev, led by Stadukin, discovered the Kolyma River. They were the first to reach the mouth of a previously unknown mysterious river. Semyon Desnev in 1648 was on the expedition of a merchant Fedor Alexiev. They reached the extreme point of Northeast Asia, which will be called Cape Desnev. On the expedition, the merchant died of scurvy, and further command passed to Semyon Desnev. On the 1st of October 1648, he landed near the Anadyr estuary, drew up drawings of the river, described the nature of Anadyr and the life of the Eskimos. Here he was as much as 11 years. Interestingly, during the expedition, a Yakut woman, who was the first woman to participate in polar expedition, was part of the team of the merchant Alexiev. In the biography of Semyon Ivanovic, there were also 2 campaigns against the indigenous inhabitants of Kamchatka in 1654.